Trump leaned into the microphone, his smirk curling like smoke, his voice cutting through the silence with a single phrase meant to wound. "Sit down, girl." For a split second, the room froze. The words hung heavy in the air, raw and unmistakable. Then came the eruption. Gasps from the audience, murmurs of disbelief, the crackle of cell phones recording, and, from one corner, a few cruel cheers. The moment was electric, volatile, and impossible to ignore. Every eye in the hall turned to Jasmine Crockett. She stood still, her hand pressed against the podium, her eyes locked on him. It wasn't just a glance. It was a glare sharpened by history, by the weight of generations told to sit down, stay quiet, know their place. And in that instant, the entire country seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether she would bend or break. The tension was unbearable. Commentators in the front row were already scribbling notes, knowing this was the clip that would dominate headlines. A cameraman zoomed in, capturing Crockett's face in sharp relief. Calm, poised, but burning with something fierce behind her silence. You could feel the crowd shift, sensing they were standing on the edge of a moment that would be replayed, dissected, and remembered. Trump leaned back in his chair, satisfied, the smirk refusing to fade. He thought he had won. To him, it was just another line, another jab, another way to reduce an opponent to a punchline. But what he didn't understand was that in dismissing her, he had lit the fuse of something bigger than the room, bigger than the debate, bigger even than himself. Because Jasmine Crockett was not about to shrink, she was not about to retreat. And as the silence deepened, as the crowd braced for what would come next, there was a sense that history itself was pausing, waiting for her to answer. And when she finally spoke, her reply was not just for Trump. It was for every woman ever silenced, every voice ever dismissed, every fight for dignity that had been pushed aside. What she said next would shake the room, ignite the country, and leave America speechless. But no one in that hall, not even Donald Trump, was prepared for the force about to be unleashed. To understand why that moment cut so deeply, you have to look beyond the walls of the debate stage. Because in today's America, words like "sit down, girl" are never just words. They echo across centuries, carrying the weight of every dismissal, every insult, every attempt to reduce women, and especially women of color, to silence. This was not just a jab in a political spat. It was a reminder of the old playbook of power: belittle, diminish, erase. And yet, it was also a test. Because America in this era is more fractured, more polarized, more desperate for clarity than ever before. The country has been battered by years of culture wars, racial reckonings, and fights over who belongs at the table. Respect itself has become a battlefield. Every word, every gesture, every headline feels like part of a larger war for the nation's soul. That is why the stakes of this confrontation towered so high. Trump wasn't just attacking Jasmine Crockett. He was symbolically pushing back against an entire wave of voices rising in politics. Women, immigrants, communities of color, and the younger generation demanding a different kind of leadership. He wanted to remind them who he thought still controlled the room, and in doing so, he revealed exactly what he feared: their power. Crockett, standing beneath the hot lights, understood all of it. She knew she had been underestimated from the start. To some, she was too young. To others, too bold. And to many of her critics, the very fact of her identity, a black woman standing tall in Congress, was enough to dismiss her before she opened her mouth. But that was precisely what made her strength undeniable. She had faced these dismissals before. They no longer rattled her, they steeled her. The audience in that hall didn't just see a clash of personalities. They saw a collision of two Americas. One clinging to old hierarchies, smirking with the confidence of unchecked arrogance. The other standing firm, unshaken, refusing to retreat into silence. It was a battle over what kind of voice gets to define the nation. And Crockett knew she wasn't just speaking for herself. She carried the echoes of history on her shoulders, the struggles of leaders before her, the marches and protests, the generations of women who were told to be smaller, quieter, less. This wasn't just about one insult. It was about whether dignity could still stand tall against derision, whether truth could pierce through arrogance, whether America could choose respect over ridicule. That's why the moment mattered so fiercely, because millions watching from home weren't tuning in to see another routine exchange of barbs. They were watching to see if someone, anyone, could answer arrogance with something greater. Not anger for its own sake, but a clarity of spirit that could cut through the noise. And when Crockett finally lifted her chin and leaned into the microphone, the atmosphere shifted. The smirk on Trump's face seemed to harden, as though he too sensed that something was about to change. What she was about to deliver wasn't a rebuttal in the usual sense. It was a reckoning. But before the first word even left her lips, one truth was already undeniable. The stakes had been raised higher than anyone in that hall could have imagined. And the answer that followed would not just shape the debate, it would reverberate far beyond it. Because this was no longer about Trump and Crockett. This was about America itself. Donald Trump's rise to power has always been marked by one defining weapon: humiliation. From the gilded boardrooms of Manhattan to the roaring rallies of his presidency, Trump has cultivated an image not just of wealth and dominance, but of someone who thrives on belittling others. For him, winning wasn't simply about policies or arguments. It was about cutting his opponents down to size, reducing them with a single phrase, a mocking nickname, or a sneer that stuck like a scar. It began long before politics. In the 1980s, as Trump's name started to plaster skylines, he discovered the thrill of not just building towers, but tearing down reputations. His battles with reporters were legendary. When journalists questioned his wealth or credibility, he lashed back with insults, calling them losers or scumbags. He relished in not answering with substance, but with put-downs sharp enough to dominate the headlines. He knew humiliation drew more attention than nuance, and Trump always craved the spotlight more than anything else. By the time he entered the political arena, the habit had hardened into a strategy. During the 2016 campaign, America witnessed it on full display. Rivals were no longer referred to by name, but by nicknames that stuck like glue. Little Marco, Low-Energy Jeb, Crooked Hillary. Each label was crafted to belittle, to take an opponent's strength and flip it into a weakness. The crowd roared every time, feeding Trump's confidence that humiliation wasn't just entertainment, it was power. But nowhere was his penchant for demeaning clearer than in the way he spoke about women. From the infamous Access Hollywood tape, where he bragged about exploiting women, to debate stage jabs about Carly Fiorina's face, his words consistently reduced women to objects of mockery. He mocked a reporter with a disability. He sneered at Gold Star families. He weaponized shame as his political brand. For Trump, arrogance wasn't a flaw. It was a feature, a core part of his identity that his base cheered as telling it like it is. Every insult, every smirk, every dismissive hand wave was a performance. He leaned into the role of the bully because he knew America's media ecosystem rewarded outrage. He understood that a cruel joke or a cutting phrase could dominate the news cycle longer than any policy proposal. Trump didn't have to be right. He only had to humiliate someone enough to seem untouchable. But arrogance has a cost. Because with every insult, every attack, every smirk, Trump created a trail of resentment and defiance. Each person he demeaned carried that sting with them, and while many wilted under his glare, there were those who didn't forget, those who waited for the moment to strike back. The night he told Jasmine Crockett to sit down, girl, wasn't an isolated slip of the tongue. It was the culmination of decades of the same playbook. Trump, standing at the podium, believed he was untouchable, that his familiar tactics of ridicule would silence yet another rising voice. To him, Crockett wasn't a congresswoman or a formidable opponent. She was just another target for the smirk, another victim of the dismissive swipe. But what Trump failed to see was that the world had shifted. The America he first stormed into with his carnival of insults had grown tired of the routine. For years, people had watched as his cruelty dominated headlines, but now the hunger was for something else. Dignity, strength, clarity. The old tricks weren't landing with the same force. Instead of silencing, they were revealing. Every insult he hurled said less about his opponent and more about his own fear of losing control. In the debate hall, when he leaned into that microphone, his smirk wasn't just arrogance, it was habit. He expected the same reaction he'd always received: shock from the audience, silence from his opponent. But instead, what rippled through the room was different. The gasp wasn't simply outrage at his words. It was recognition that this was the same playbook America had seen again and again. The mask had slipped, revealing not strength, but the fragility beneath arrogance. Trump's persona, built on humiliation, had always thrived on others backing down. But Crockett wasn't built to back down. She had come from a world where insults weren't an anomaly. They were the daily reality. And unlike many of Trump's past opponents, she didn't carry the burden of trying to match his arrogance. She carried something deeper: resilience. And that's what Trump never understood. Arrogance has a breaking point. For years, he had leaned on humiliation as though it were armor. But the same arrogance that once made him untouchable was now making him predictable. The same smirk that once silenced opponents now revealed his weakness. And on that stage, in that moment, Trump was about to learn that the woman he tried to dismiss with a single word was not only ready for him, she was about to turn his entire strategy against him, because the weapon he had sharpened for decades was finally about to be used against him, and Jasmine Crockett was holding it steady. Jasmine Crockett's story is not one of privilege, shortcuts, or inherited power. It is the story of grit carved out in courtrooms, community centers, and streets where voices were too often ignored. Before America knew her as the woman standing toe-to-toe with Donald Trump, she was the lawyer who showed up when nobody else would, the advocate who refused to let the powerful drown out the powerless. Born and raised in St. Louis, Crockett grew up watching injustice unfold in plain sight. She saw how money and influence shielded some, while others, often women, people of color, and working families, were left exposed, unheard, dismissed. It was this inequity that pushed her into the law. But Crockett wasn't drawn to the polished corridors of corporate firms. She chose defense, activism, and cases that others called messy or hopeless. In cramped courtrooms and late-night strategy sessions, she earned a reputation: the lawyer who would fight until her last breath if it meant her client's voice was heard. That same fighting spirit carried her into politics. When she entered Congress, she wasn't just another freshman representative. She was a firebrand. Known for her sharp tongue, quick wit, and unwillingness to mince words, Crockett quickly became a lightning rod in hearings. She was the kind of lawmaker who could strip down the evasions of a witness with a single question, who could expose hypocrisy with biting clarity. But she wasn't loud for the sake of noise. She was loud because silence had been weaponized against her community for generations. Her colleagues, even her allies, sometimes underestimated her. They saw her as too brash, too unapologetic, too willing to call things as they were. But for Crockett, respectability politics was just another cage. She refused to shrink herself to make others comfortable. Every raised eyebrow, every condescending smirk thrown her way only deepened her resolve. She knew exactly who she was and whom she represented, the millions of Americans whose truths were always cut short by someone else talking over them. Crockett's congressional battles became moments of viral clarity. Clips of her fiery exchanges ricocheted across social media. When opponents tried to dismiss her, she turned their attempts into lessons on power, race, and gender in America. "Don't mistake my passion for lack of discipline," she once snapped back at a colleague who tried to lecture her. That line became more than a rebuttal. It became a rallying cry for women who had been told they were too much, simply, for daring to speak with conviction. And it wasn't just performance. Behind the viral clips was a lifetime of preparation. As a lawyer, Crockett had learned how to dismantle arguments piece by piece, exposing contradictions until the truth stood bare. As a black woman, she had lived through the experience of being underestimated, dismissed, told to sit down and wait her turn. Those scars didn't silence her. They trained her to wield her voice with precision. Every congressional hearing, every late-night floor debate, every community meeting where she stood in front of people who had lost faith in the system, they were all rehearsals for the night she faced Trump. Crockett wasn't just another politician stepping onto that stage. She was the sum of every courtroom fight, every insult she'd brushed off, every door slammed in her face. She had been underestimated her entire life, and it had forged her into someone who could no longer be ignored. What made her dangerous to Trump wasn't simply her intelligence or her debating skills. It was that she knew exactly what he was trying to do because she had seen it all before. The smirk, the belittling phrase, the dismissal cloaked as dominance. She had watched men like him fill courtrooms, workplaces, and the halls of power her entire life. But she also knew the deeper truth. Bullies thrived on silence. Their power only lasted as long as no one dared to push back. And Crockett had built her career on pushing back. She didn't just represent herself. She carried the weight of every woman who had ever been called girl as a way to strip them of authority. She carried the voices of every young black lawyer told they weren't professional enough. She carried the defiance of every voter whose dignity had been dismissed by politicians more interested in sound bites than solutions. When Trump leaned into that mic and sneered, "Sit down, girl," the words were meant to shrink her. But to Crockett, they landed as familiar. The echo of every dismissive voice she had already outlasted. He wasn't saying anything she hadn't heard before. The difference was, now she had the platform to answer, and millions were watching. Her journey had prepared her for this exact moment. All the trials, the doubts, the bruises of being overlooked, they weren't obstacles, they were training grounds. Where others might have flinched or fallen silent, Crockett's instinct was sharpened steel. She knew that a single response could cut through decades of arrogance. She knew that by standing her ground, she wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for history. And so, as the audience held its breath, waiting to see if she would falter, Crockett rose taller. Every battle that had forged her resilience surged into her voice. She wasn't there to exchange insults. She was there to make a statement that would ripple far beyond the debate hall. Because this wasn't just about one insult. It wasn't just about Donald Trump. This was about proving that dignity, clarity, and truth could withstand even the loudest arrogance. Her entire journey had prepared her for this one moment. The room crackled with tension. After Trump's sneering dismissal, the moderators tried to steer the conversation back on track, but it was too late. The clash had ignited. Cameras zoomed in, every lens hungry for the next viral moment. Trump leaned forward in his chair, his lips pursed, his hands cutting through the air with exaggerated gestures. His voice rose, sharp and domineering, designed to drown out everything around him. "People don't want to hear lectures from you," he barked, jabbing his finger toward Crockett. "You're all talk, no results, just like every other radical leftist who's ruined this country." Gasps spread through the crowd. His words were aggressive, laced with the swagger of a man who had long relied on volume to eclipse substance. He was in his element, or so he thought. Crockett didn't flinch. Her expression stayed composed. Her gaze locked on him like a spotlight exposing cracks in stone. She waited, just long enough for the silence between his insults to stretch, making him fumble to fill it with more noise. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, deliberate, cutting through his bluster like glass slicing paper. "Mr. Trump," she said, steady as steel, "you confuse noise with strength, but this country has paid the price for your tantrums." The audience erupted, half cheers, half jeers. Trump's face flushed crimson. He shot back instantly, trying to regain control. He spoke over her, louder, faster, like a man fighting against the tide. His sentences stumbled, interrupted by his own need to dominate the stage. No, you're wrong. Listen, everybody knows. You don't know what you're talking about. But Crockett never raised her voice. She kept her tone measured, every word deliberate. The contrast was jarring. Trump red-faced and flailing, Crockett unshaken, her hands calmly resting on the podium. The optics alone told a story, the old guard of bluster and bullying, crashing against the immovable wall of quiet conviction. As interruptions flew, the moderators struggled to keep order, but the audience leaned in, electric with anticipation, sensing history unfolding. Every time Trump tried to bulldoze through her words, Crockett pushed back with clarity. "I will not be silenced," she said firmly, cutting through his attempt to talk over her. "And America is tired of being silenced by men like you." The hall shook with applause. Trump's jaw tightened. He leaned even closer into the mic, practically shouting now, his voice breaking under the strain of his fury. His hands slammed the podium, his posture radiating frustration. The louder he grew, the more composed Crockett became. And that was the heart of the escalation. His chaos, met by her calm. Every time his temper spiked, she countered with poise, forcing the audience to see the stark contrast. For years, Trump had thrived by dragging opponents into the mud, by baiting them into matching his anger. But Crockett refused to take the bait. She stood her ground, not by meeting his rage, but by exposing it. The crowd began to turn. You could hear it in the shifts of applause, in the murmurs between gasps. Every insult Trump hurled now landed weaker, every interruption more desperate. Crockett's composure was winning the silent war of perception. And then, as the tension reached its peak, Trump made the mistake. It was the kind of line that seemed instinctive to him, the kind of cruelty he had delivered 1,000 times before. But this time, the moment was different. The cameras unblinking, the nation listening. He leaned in, his voice dripping with condescension, his words louder than ever. "You don't belong here. People like you should know their place." The words hung in the air, heavy, unmistakable, echoing through the hall like a gavel strike. The audience fell silent. Even the moderators froze, wide-eyed. And Crockett, calm as ever, looked at him with the poise of someone who had been waiting her whole life for this moment. And then Trump made the mistake that would cost him everything. The air was thick with anticipation. Trump's words, "You don't belong here. People like you should know their place," still reverberated through the hall like a cruel echo from another century. Gasps had given way to an almost eerie silence. Every eye in the audience turned to Jasmine Crockett, waiting to see how she would respond. Some expected fury, others expected tears. What they got was something else entirely. Crockett leaned forward just slightly, her hands still steady on the podium. She let the silence stretch for a heartbeat longer, letting Trump's insult rot in the air. Then, in a voice calm but ringing with clarity, she began. "My place, Mr. Trump," she said, her words measured and deliberate, "is standing right here, on this stage, in front of millions of Americans who are tired of watching bullies like you pretend that shouting is leadership." A ripple of applause broke through, hesitant at first, but growing louder. She didn't pause for it. "My place is in Congress, where I was elected by the people, not handed privilege by birth or bought with inheritance. My place is fighting for families who have to live with the chaos you left behind." The cheers swelled. Trump shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening as he tried to cut in. But Crockett's rhythm was unstoppable now, each line landing like a hammer on stone. "You tell me to sit down," she continued, her eyes locked on him. "But women in this country have been told to sit down for centuries. Black women, especially, were told to stay quiet, to stay small, to stay invisible. And yet, here I am, visible, unshaken, unapologetic. Gasps erupted, followed by thunderous applause. A chant began somewhere in the back of the audience, echoing her words. "Here she is! Here she is!" Trump fumbled with his mic, trying to interject, but every time he leaned in to speak, the roar of the crowd drowned him out. His usual tactic, dominating the stage with volume, was failing in real time. Crockett pressed on, her cadence sharp, her words rising with conviction. "You see, this isn't about me alone. When you dismiss me, you dismiss every little girl watching tonight who has ever been told she isn't enough. You dismiss every immigrant family who has been told they don't belong. You dismiss every working parent who has been told their struggles don't matter. But the truth, Mr. Trump, is that they do matter, and they're watching you prove, once again, why you should never be trusted with power." The hall exploded into cheers, people rising to their feet. Even the moderators looked stunned, frozen in the gravity of the moment. Trump's face reddened further. He slammed a hand on his podium and barked into his mic. "That's not true! None of that is true!" His voice cracked with desperation, but Crockett didn't even look at him. She lifted her chin slightly, her voice stronger than ever. "You call it strength to insult women. You call it leadership to mock immigrants. You call it patriotism to divide Americans against each other. But the truth is simpler. It's cowardice. And tonight, the cowardice is on full display." The crowd gasped. Some shouted in support, others whistled, the sound swirling into a storm of energy. Trump sputtered, raising his voice louder, trying to regain control. But his words tangled together, incoherent, swallowed by the ovation. Crockett leaned in closer to the mic now, her voice softening, not out of weakness, but with the precision of someone delivering the final blow. The room hushed instantly, every ear straining to hear. "You tell me to know my place. Well, let me tell you something, Mr. Trump. My place is not beneath you. My place is not behind you. My place is not silent in the face of your arrogance. My place is exactly here, standing toe-to-toe with you, and reminding America that dignity will always outshine your disgrace." For a beat, the hall went silent. The words hung in the air, undeniable. And then, as if released from a collective breath, the audience erupted. The ovation shook the rafters. Cheers, claps, whistles, people on their feet pounding the floor. The sound was deafening. Trump, rattled, gripped his podium with both hands, his knuckles white. He tried again to cut in, his mouth opening, but his voice was swallowed in the roar of approval for Crockett. For the first time, his dominance of the stage evaporated before the eyes of millions watching live. Crockett didn't bask in the applause. She didn't gloat. Instead, she waited for the noise to crest, then gently raised her hand. The crowd quieted, ready for her final word. "Tonight," she said slowly, her eyes never leaving Trump's, "you told me to sit down. But let this be clear. The days of women like me sitting down are over. We are standing up. And we're not sitting back down, ever again." The words detonated like fireworks. The hall shook with applause so fierce it seemed endless. Viewers at home would later describe it as the moment the tide turned, the moment history crystallized into one unforgettable image. Jasmine Crockett, calm, resolute, delivering a takedown so devastating it left Donald Trump rattled, exposed, and diminished. The moderators, still stunned, struggled to regain control of the debate, but the damage was already done. Trump stood there, red-faced and sputtering, a man undone not by anger, but by the sharp, unyielding truth of a woman who refused to bow. And in the closing seconds of the exchange, Crockett leaned back from her podium, her eyes still steady, and delivered the line that would be replayed across every screen in America. "Mr. Trump, history will remember this moment, not as the night you tried to silence me, but as the night you proved you could be silenced by the truth." The crowd roared, cameras flashed, and Trump, so accustomed to being the loudest voice in the room, stood there, visibly shaken, with nothing left to say. Crockett had dropped the mic, and America had witnessed a turning point. The debate ended, but the moment refused to fade. Within minutes of Crockett's devastating counterattack, social media platforms lit up like fireworks. On Twitter, the hashtag #SitDownGirl, Trump's insult, was quickly hijacked and flipped into a rallying cry of resistance. Side by side, Crockett clapbacks surged, trending worldwide within the hour. TikTok filled with remixes of her mic drop line, set to triumphant music, spliced with footage of cheering crowds. Instagram reels showcased split screens. Trump's red-faced rage on one side, Crockett's calm, unflinching gaze on the other. By sunrise, the numbers were staggering. Tens of millions of views, countless retweets, endless shares. It wasn't just a political moment. It had mutated into cultural currency. Teens who had never watched a debate were quoting Crockett in school hallways. Meme pages that usually trafficked in pop culture now had her face plastered over captions like, "Dignity beats arrogance, every time." Cable news seized on the drama instantly. CNN played the clip on a loop, their panelists nearly giddy as they analysed every beat of Crockett's response. MSNBC went further, declaring it the most powerful debate takedown since Obama's 2008 rise. Even mainstream morning shows, usually careful with politics, couldn't resist. "The moment America can't stop talking about," teased one anchor as they cut to Crockett's words yet again. But the real shockwaves came from voices outside the usual political bubble. Celebrities weighed in. Ava DuVernay tweeted, "Black women have been holding this country accountable since day one." Jasmine Crockett just reminded the world. Mark Ruffalo posted, "That was courage. That was clarity. That was leadership." Even sports stars chimed in, with LeBron James writing simply, "Mic dropped." Everyday Americans added their own testimonies. A Latina teacher in Arizona posted a tearful video. "I've told my students for years that their voices matter. Tonight, Jasmine Crockett proved it on the biggest stage." A Black grandmother in Georgia wrote, "I never thought I'd see the day someone looked Trump in the eye and told him the truth so plainly. She did it for all of us." Meanwhile, Trump's camp scrambled. Surrogates tried to spin the exchange, claiming Crockett had been disrespectful or unhinged. But their clips, stripped of context, only fueled more laughter online. Side-by-side edits showed Trump's bluster melting against Crockett's composure. The villain who once thrived on humiliation now looked small, out of touch, unable to handle the very tactics he had perfected. Commentators framed it as a role reversal, a shift in the story America had told itself for years. Trump, long the master of dominating the stage with insult and intimidation, was suddenly the one shrinking under the spotlight. Crockett, underestimated, dismissed, told to sit down, instead became the symbol of standing tall when it mattered most. The symbolism was too potent to ignore. Headlines crystallized it. Crockett's clapback becomes a movement. The Washington Post. The moment, Trump finally met his match. The New York Times. From insult to icon, Crockett turns the tables. Rolling Stone. Pundits debated the political fallout, but the cultural verdict was already clear. Crockett had etched herself into history, not just as a sharp debater, but as a voice of dignity in an era starving for it. And the impact stretched beyond the debate hall. Young activists began organizing rallies under the banner of "Stand Up, Don't Sit Down." Merchandise popped up overnight. T-shirts, mugs, even phone cases emblazoned with Crockett's final line. History will remember this moment. For progressives long searching for a unifying figure who could both fight back and inspire, Crockett had delivered a lightning bolt. Trump, meanwhile, found himself cast in a role he had never played before. Not the swaggering strongman, but the flustered antagonist who had finally been bested. His attempt to reduce a black woman to silence had instead amplified her voice to the loudest echo in America. The shockwaves didn't end with applause or memes. They lingered in conversations across kitchen tables, classrooms, and workplaces. Parents told their daughters, "Did you see her? That's how you stand up to a bully." Immigrants told their children, "That's why we came here, so we could speak truth to power." And for countless people who had felt invisible, Crockett had given them visibility in the sharpest, most undeniable way possible. It was more than a debate moment. It was more than politics. It was a cultural reset. And as the dust settled, one truth became impossible to ignore. The villain had been exposed, and the hero had emerged, not just as a debater, but as a symbol of resilience, pride, and dignity. Jasmine Crockett had not only answered Trump, she had answered history, and America was still buzzing with the aftershocks. When the applause faded and the lights dimmed, what lingered wasn't just the sting of Trump's words, or even the thrill of Crockett's clapback. What endured was something deeper, the reframing of a moment that could have been nothing more than an insult, but instead became a declaration. Crockett made clear that "Sit Down Girl" was never about her alone. It was about every woman who had been told she was too loud, every immigrant told to stay in their place, every person of color told they didn't belong at the table of power. Her reply, delivered with the precision of a scalpel and the force of a hammer, transformed the insult into a mirror. In Trump's words, America heard echoes of its oldest prejudices, gender dismissed, race diminished, power clinging to its old ways. In Crockett's answer, America saw the possibility of something different, strength that didn't come from belittling others, but from standing tall in dignity. For too long, arrogance had masqueraded as strength in American politics. But on that stage, Crockett shattered the illusion. She showed that courage wasn't the loudest voice or the sharpest insult. It was calm. It was conviction. It was the ability to stand unshaken while the storm raged. And in that steadiness, millions watching felt themselves steady too. The moral was plain. Dignity will always silence arrogance. Arrogance feeds on fear, but dignity disarms it. Arrogance thrives in chaos, but courage restores order. Crockett proved that you don't need to match cruelty with cruelty. You can defeat it with clarity, truth, and an unyielding belief in your own worth. In that sense, this clash was never just about two people sparring on a debate stage. It was about America's promise, the promise that no matter who tries to push you down, the nation still belongs to those who rise. That democracy isn't protected by bullies who shout, but by citizens who refuse to be silenced. That progress isn't built on insults, but on the relentless determination to keep moving forward, even when the weight of history tries to drag you back. And so the insult, meant to diminish, instead elevated. Crockett's voice carried beyond the walls of that debate hall, into homes, into schools, into conversations across the nation. Her stand reminded millions that one voice can ripple into many, and that courage is contagious. When one voice stands tall, millions feel taller. That was the moral. Not written in a textbook, but lived in real time. For every girl who saw herself in Crockett's defiance, for every man or woman who had swallowed silence in the face of disrespect, for every immigrant who wondered if their place in America was secure, this was the answer. Yes, you belong. Yes, you matter. And yes, your voice can change the story. History will mark this night not for the insult, but for the transformation of it. Not for the man who tried to belittle, but for the woman who refused to bow. And in that reversal, the lesson shines clear. Arrogance eventually consumes itself, but dignity multiplies. Crockett left the stage not just as a debater who had won an exchange, but as a symbol. A reminder that leadership is not measured in volume, but in vision. That strength is not in domination, but in the ability to elevate others, and that when one voice dares to rise, it gives millions permission to rise too. In the end, Trump's words will be remembered as an attempted weapon that backfired. Crockett's words will be remembered as the spark that lit a movement. And The moral will echo long after the debate hall emptied. Dignity and courage will always outshine arrogance. Always. Trump thought he could silence her with a smirk and 3 little words. Sit down, girl. But instead of shrinking, Jasmine Crockett rose higher. What was meant to humiliate became the very spark that turned the tables. His attempt to belittle her backfired spectacularly, and the whole nation witnessed it in real time. This wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a reminder of something bigger, something we can't afford to forget. Respect will always outlast disrespect. Dignity will always cut deeper than arrogance. When power tries to mock and diminish, the truth has a way of finding its voice. And in that moment, Crockett's voice carried for millions who've been told to stay quiet, stay small, stay in their place. The lesson is crystal clear. Strength isn't measured by how loud you shout, but by how firmly you stand. Courage isn't found in insults. It's found in refusing to bow to them. And when one leader dares to rise above the noise, it gives all of us permission to rise with them. That's why this moment matters. Because it's not just about one debate, one stage, or even one man. It's about the kind of America we want to live in. An America where respect trumps disrespect, where dignity outshines arrogance, and where no one is ever told to sit down simply for daring to stand tall. So if you believe America needs more, voices like Crockett's, voices that speak truth, fight for respect, and refuse to be silenced, then this is your moment too. Share this video, subscribe to the channel, join the movement. Because when we amplify courage, we build a future where no insult can drown out dignity.